So already this book opens up a little bit differently than the other two, because in the other two, the prologues were a glimpse in Jude's past, a glimpse at her childhood, but here we're getting a glimpse at Cardan's. We're getting a glimpse of when he was born and brought before the royal astrologer. And already, like, it's interesting because they point out that, you know, Lady Asha waited, whereas the other, you know, mothers brought their babies immediately to the king and their astrologer to get their prophecies. But also I wonder if the room was crowded when they gave theirs, because here it's only like 5 people in the room. So already we're seeing that no one cared about Cardan. Even from his birth, no one cared about him. Also, this chapter is being narrated by Baffin, the royal astrologer, and he notes pretty early on that Lady Asha holds baby Cardan awkwardly. Like, she doesn't know how to hold him. Like, she hopes someone would come and take him off her hands, at least until he gives his prophecy that Cardan is the ruination of the throne. Then she holds him closely. And it's not because she worries for her child's future. She worries for her future. He is her ticket to something greater, to more power, to a better position in court. Because without him, she doesn't have it. Because, you know, having the child of the king gives her a better place. So she needs him, even though she doesn't like him. None but his mother exerted any hold over him, and she seldom tried to curb his excesses. Just the opposite. "You're a prince," she told him firmly when he would shy away from the conflict or fail to make a demand. "Everything is yours. You have only to take it, and sometimes I want that. Get it for me." So obviously she used his position to benefit herself, but also at such a young age, she taught him to be who he became later. That it was so much harder for Cardan to break these habits later in life. It took him quite a while, and he has to still work against what he has learned throughout most of his life, despite Balkan trying to fix some of that, and Jude definitely trying to fix some of that. And even when Cardan was still young, Dane knew at the heart what Cardan wanted. That's Dane's best skill, is that he knew exactly at the heart what people want, and that's how he manipulates them to work for him. That's how he got Jude to work for him. Knowing that she wanted a place in this world of fairy, he knows that Cardan wants his father's attention. That's why he asked him to shoot a walnut off a mortal's head, saying keen marksmanship so impresses her father, and Cardan willingly does it, even though it ends up backfiring on him, because that's what Dane does. And these final paragraphs of the prologue tells us so much, because it's telling us that, like, one, Prince Cardan was never heard. He could, you know, tell his side of the story, but he was never going to be heard and never going to be, like, believed. So why argue against things? You know, that's why he started to have this kind of defeatist, just go with the flow kind of personality going forward, especially against Dane, who his every word would be believed by their father. But also that, like, you know, instead of being punished as a way of a prince, his mother was sent to the tower for getting it's her fault. So he sees that continuously going forward too, that others would be punished in his stead. So like, it kind of like skews his morality. Like, part of him doesn't learn because he's not being punished, but part of him feels guilty because others are being punished for his own actions. And the prologue ends with, Prince Cardan was given over to Balkan, the eldest of the siblings, the cruelest, and the only one willing to take him in. And so was Prince Cardan's reputation made. He had little to do but further it. And one is showing that Prince Balkan said in the last book that none of his siblings ever stood up for him. None of them took him in. None of them actually cared about him. They might have been nice, but they didn't care. Only Balkan did, and that's why they have a weird relationship. But also that Prince Cardan's reputation was made at such an early age. And that, you know, he learned with that incident with Prince Dane that no one was going to believe him if he tried to fight against it. It was just easier to lean into this reputation, to become this cruel, lazy prince, than to fight against this idea. Now, the first line of chapter 1s I think are very important, and something that a lot of authors spend a lot of time thinking about. And the one for this book is, I, Jude Durante, High Queen of Elfhame in exile, spend most of my mornings dozing in front of daytime televisions. It continues, but it's the I, Jude Durante, High Queen of Elfhame in exile is important to me because it's her reminding herself of her title, because just like with names, titles have a little bit of power. So it's Jude trying to cling to the power that she had for as long as she can, but also it's like a reminder that she's back in the mortal world. She's watching daytime television, watching these shows, and she's afraid, I think, of like her life in Elfhame turning into almost like a dream, that she could forget that it ever actually happened, that she ever was made into its High Queen. And then Jude says, I keep my head down, as I probably should have done in the first place. So she almost is like reverting back to who she was all the way in the beginning of book 1, when she would put her head down, when she would like take punches and be hurt and be made fun of and just keep her head down to keep moving. But Jude has gone through so much, and we hope that she goes back to who she is, but I love that she kind of doubts the journey that she had been on. I also love this line, and if I curse Carden, then I have to curse myself too, for being the fool who walked right into the trap he set for me. And it's sad because it's her still thinking Carden as the gatekeeper to this world, but she is now blaming herself for what happened, her downfall. She thinks that if she had just kept her head down like she had been doing before, then maybe she wouldn't have lost everything, that she had taken too big of a risk. Not realize she's doubting her actions. She's doubting that, she needed to take the reins and actually, seize this opportunity, not wait for someone to hand it to her. And it's sad but also that she still believes this lie that Carden is against her, that he is out to get her, out to prevent her from entering this world. We're kind of seeing Jude experience that the grass is always greener on the other side, that when she was in Fairy, she kind of missed certain things about the mortal world, but now that she's trapped in the mortal world, she misses aspects of Fairy, and one of the ones that she says is that, maybe I miss being afraid. I feel as though I'm dreaming away my days, restless, never fully awake. And it's kind of a similar experience that, soldiers have coming back from war, that you're always on high alert, and then all of a sudden you're thrown back into normal life, that you don't know how to exist, not at that high intensity anymore. This moment of Oak is very interesting because, for one, it's showing that for Oak, using magic comes so easily, that it's just instinctual, that it's as easy as breathing, that it's gonna happen. But it's also like a mirroring of Jude, that you can take this fairy child and put him in the mortal world, but eventually his fairy self is going to be exposed. Just as Jude, a mortal child from fairy, can pretend and act like a fairy child, but eventually her mortal self will be exposed. And then we see this moment where Jude definitely is influenced by Maddox and Maddox's upbringing as a parent, because that's the parent that she knew the most. That when she goes to scare Oak, it's not a normal, jump and poke at him. It's holding him tight and squeezing him to a point that it's terrifying and, deadly. And I think that's just how Maddox had trained her to be afraid like that. And she's trying to install that in Oak now, being like, you never know when someone might sneak up on him. Jude's not wrong, as we know in later in the Stolen Heir, that there's numerous assassination attempts on Oak's life, but it's still interesting that she treats him the way that Maddox had treated her. Actually, it's interesting in general because we saw this in the last book too, where Jude believed that Vivi's girlfriend should also be a little bit afraid, that you should tell her the terrifying things, because the terrifying things keep you alive. And it kind of goes back to the classic fairy tales, especially the Grimm fairy tales, where they're dark and a little twisted and scary, but the fear of it is supposed to teach a lesson to the kids that you should be wary of strangers in the woods. You should be wary of doing these things, that you should listen to your parents, and it all works out in the end, but you should be careful. It's funny that Jude was always so wary of Carden wanting to keep the throne, but we're seeing already Oak is viewing the throne the same way Carden does. He sees it as cursed, that it's because his father and Jude are fighting for the crown for him, that he is also exiled technically from Fairy, away from his home and his mother. And so he doesn't want to be anywhere near that. And it's the same as Carden. Carden didn't want to be anywhere near that center of power. He wanted to be as far away from the throne. I feel like it's been a while, especially in the last couple books, since I talked about fairy personalities, and I think that it's based off how they live their lives. So they're a little bit more selfish. One, it could be toxic like Lady Asha, but I think it has to do with the fact that everything that they do in their world is kind of done with bargains and deals, as nothing's just given freely, that usually there's some string attached, that if say the servant that Tatterfell, she is in servitude to Maddox because he saved the life of her husband, so she's paying it off. And so we're seeing now Heather kind of ignoring Oak storming by and Jude's mood, because her girlfriend wants to get back with her, so she's thinking about herself, not looking at others' emotions. She can acknowledge it, but it's not what they do instinctively, because they learned in their culture to be a little bit more selfish, I think. It's also interesting that Vivi is a little bit more, even though she's older, a little bit more naive. And I think it's in part that the world hasn't fought against her in the way that Jude's has. That, she thinks that her girlfriend, she wants to come back. Everything's going to be like it was before, whereas Jude's that's not going to happen. Leaves don't grow back on the vines, cracked walnuts don't fit back into the shells. She's learned from experience that, she was taken from the undersea, and when she was returned, her world didn't go back to what it was. It was all taken away, and now she had to, fight tooth and nail to try to get a little bit of power back, and then it was taken away again. So it doesn't just go back. Once again, we see Jude kind of straddling between these two worlds because she thinks, I am disloyal no matter what I do. Vivi is my sister, but Heather is human. I owe them both something. And we see that she thinks that you can't satisfy both. And in a lot of cases, you can't satisfy both. But she has this awkward place where she's trying to appease both sides of herself. When Vivi finally kind of like acknowledges like, oh, what was wrong with Oak, by the way? Like, is he gonna be this dramatic when he's a teenager? Jude's like, oh, he doesn't want to be High King. And Vivi responds, oh, that, I thought it was something important. And it made me stop and think, I think this is why Oak turns into a decent person later in life. And like, as decent as a person can be. But I will be doing, by the way, an in-depth dissection of The Stolen Heir after this book. I've only read it once, but I think he was a decent being, you know, against the odds. And I think it has to do with his three sisters being the ones to help raise him instead of just Maddox, as the case with Jude and Taryn is. So like Vivi, I think, is going to teach him to be carefree, to be able to shrug things off, to still have fun in life. Taryn's probably going to teach him about how to behave in court, like court etiquette and stuff like that. And Jude teaches him how to defend himself, the court politics. And I think the combination of the three nurtures and grows him into who he becomes in The Stolen Heir. I don't think it was ever going to be possible for Jude to go back to the mortal world and just exist as a mortal, to forget about her old life. And even in the first chapter, she is afraid of her forgetting about her old life as she sits in front of the TV. But it would have never happened with Oak being in the same house as her and Vivi. She would have always known of its existence and been bitter that she has been exiled, even though we know that she technically isn't. But we also see that the Roach, for instance, is sending people her way, giving her jobs, keeping her connected to that world, even if she is not living in that world. So no matter what, Jude still would have been connected with the world of fairy, but I think because she had been at the center of its vortex, anything less is not good enough. I kind of love that we're still seeing Jude hang on to this misbelief so strongly that she still believes that Cardan is the gatekeeper to the world of fairy, and he has now exiled her, cut her off, that she's not allowed to interact with it. At least in her head, she thinks that. And we see that when she says, "and looking for work, off the books." And when she says off the books, she doesn't mean it in the way that we mean it. She means like, don't let Cardan know that I'm still involved with fairy, because she thinks that he doesn't want her involved with fairy at all, when that's not the case at all. Also, this line is a throwaway line, but it says a lot when she says, he didn't ask for oaths of loyalty or any promises whatsoever, because that has played such a big role in every other interaction she has had with fairy, with Dane, with Cardan, with Maddox, and all these other people demanding oaths and promises. She even demanded oaths and promises, but yet here's this fairy that's not demanding that of her. But also the guy that like gives her jobs is interesting, because we see that he's like a mesh of like human and fairy clothing, and he's holding a pocket watch. And when she's like, oh, am I late? I told time by the slant of the moon, he's like, you don't have to put on airs, God. But like, it's showing that there are fairies that are more progressive, that they are meshing their old ways of fairy with mortals, that they're willing to take that step. And that's the step that I think she hopes to achieve. But Jude grew up in a system where they were more traditionalist, typically, where they, you know, abided and lived and acted by the old ways and old prejudices. And even though she wants to be more progressive, she still has this like slight inherent traditionalist prejudice that comes through in certain moments. I love Jude saying, I am the High Queen of Elfin, which she doesn't say. She thinks it to herself when he's like, you're no one special. And she's like, he's right, I'm not special. But it makes me think of this moment in Game of Thrones, because I just came across this scene on TikTok, and it's with Tywin and Tyrion, and Tyrion's like, you just sent the king to bed without supper, basically. And Tywin points out, if you think a crown makes someone powerful, then you're deluded, pretty much. And Tyrion is like, you're right, it's an army. And I think this is something that Jude is kind of learning, that just because you have a title and a crown doesn't give you power automatically, that you still need other resources to give you power. We get this other throwaway line where we basically learn that Maddox used to read to them at bedtime. Like, I'm assuming both of the twins, from like Grandma Mog's like biography of her battle strategy, and she's like a red cap general of like the scariest court. And that explains so much, obviously, of Jude, but also Taryn, because Taryn, I can assume that she probably yearned for the classic fairy tale stories, because it seems like that's what she wants for herself. But she grew up listening at bedtime to battle strategies, and explains why she almost has this like paranoid sense to her, that she always is kind of putting on an air of like a fairy tale princess, but looks at everyone warily, like she's waiting for them to attack her. we're seeing this brief moment where Jude kind of hesitates after learning it's Grandma Mog. She's actually terrified because she's grown up listening to these terrifying stories of her. And she doesn't have to take the job. She recognizes that she can just turn around, but yet she continues because she's curious. That's what she tells herself. But I think what she doesn't tell herself is that she wants to face Grandma Mog and see if she can defeat her, because she would be a surrogate of Maddox and even Carden. Of like, if I can defeat this terrifying red cap general, then I can defeat anyone else. It's actually interesting that Jude has dubbed herself this role of being like the protector of mortals against fairy, when she understands them like very little. Like literally every time she goes in the mortal world, she sees them as other, that she's obviously different, that she doesn't understand them, she's not like them. She continuously says that until a fairy does something to a mortal, then all of a sudden she is their protector. I love when Grandma Mog brings up like a secret about the High King that she can reveal, and she's like, I don't want to know, which reveals itself. But also I feel like this is the first time she's really thinking about Carden and everything. Like the floodgates open, she's thinking, does he have a new seneschal? Does he have a new lover? Showing like, did I lose my position? Did I lose my chance at love? But it's interesting that her power is the first thing that she thinks about. Then like, is he going to council meetings himself? Is showing like, is he not going to give up the throne to Oak anymore? Is he truly in its entirely the High King? Does he talk about me? Does he and Locke mock me together? Does Taryn laugh? Was this all just a whole scheme, a ploy to make fun of me, a game? And was Taryn a part of this just as she was in the first book with Locke? Jude thinks this line, it feels good to be fighting someone other than myself, when in actuality she's still fighting herself. Grandma Mog is her mirror image, is a possibility of her, a version of her, a version where she is like a red cap, where she does adopt more Maddox's personality and style, where she is more bloodthirsty, where she doesn't hold that part of herself back, where this is someone that's also exiled, someone that yearns for these games, yearns to be back in fairy. Grandma Mog is her mirror, and she's still fighting herself. I also love watching the way that she fights Grandma Mog, because literally there's a moment where Grandma Mog says, that's cheating, girl, and she says, I'm no knight. And it's showing that she would have been probably a different person. She would have been honorable in every aspect of her life if she had been allowed to go down that path and being a knight, but it was blocked for her. And then Dane appeared offering a new path, one that's more like a mercenary, where winning meant more than honor. And so she learned that style, and we see time and time again ever since she agreed to go down that path with Dane, that she kind of throws honor to the wayside when winning is on the table. She would rather win than be honorable. So Jude gets stuck on the couple words that Grandma Mog says, which is your High King and dethroned. Now, when she says your High King, I think she means like you're his seneschal, but in Jude's head, she's probably thinking in like ownership, like he's hers and being dethroned. And like, she's probably thinking like, if anyone's going to dethrone him, it's going to be me. And if he is, that means that we lose the avenue of Oak getting it. But I think she won't admit it to herself, but she's probably thinking, I'm going to lose my avenue to power, because technically I'm the High Queen. That if he is dethroned, then I lose my avenue to power, because I'm assuming that she would no longer be the High Queen anymore, and she needs power. She wants to be back in the center of the vortex. And if he's dethroned, then she loses pretty much every possible avenue to it. So since this is not my first time, nor is it my second time rereading this book, I knew that chapter 3 is where we're going to have Taryn reintroduce the story. And I was thinking about it as I was driving home from work. And I was thinking, you know, why didn't Carden convince Taryn to go to the Mortal World Standard to convince Jude to come back, even if he thinks that Jude did get his letters and was purposely ignoring them? But then it hit me, Taryn probably can't go to court anymore. And even if she's deluded enough and thinking that she got away with it, that he's blaming Jude and that's why she's exiled, she would probably go to court and immediately see Carden glaring at her because she tricked Carden in releasing Maddox from his vow. Or at the very least, even if she convinced herself that he still doesn't know, he probably thinks that she is reminding him of Jude. She still couldn't really have a place at court right now. Like, there'd be no way that Carden would let her, or even maybe even Locke, that close. So she's ruining her in Locke's position. So that's telling me that either Taryn didn't think that far in advance, or she knew and still chose to advance her father's political goals, even if it meant harming her husband, which feels like a very Alicent Hightower or Cersei Lannister kind of choice. Yeah, so that was the thoughts I had as I drove home. But let's get into chapter 3, I guess. Jude fell asleep on the bus and is shaken awake by the bus driver. She talks about how there wouldn't have been a time not that long ago where he wouldn't have been able to finish speaking before she pressed a knife to his throat, but she doesn't even have her knife on her anymore. She forgot to get it. And I think she's still feeling the repercussions of her being taken from the Undersea, that it didn't happen that long ago, and she's still kind of rocked by it, that I don't think she got the chance to reacclimate to the fairy world, and so she's not as sharp as she had used to be, and she's kind of letting things slip through the cracks. She's still cunning and still can win sometimes, as she did with Grandma Mog, but she's not as sharp as she used to be, and I think it's still going to take her some time, and that's why she's going to fumble for a little bit more during this book. It's not till towards the end that she had spent some more time in fairy again, reacclimating, that she actually is finally sharp again. I love this moment with Heather because it's showing how intoxicating the world of fairy is. How even when it is terrifying and she doesn't want to have anything to do with it, it lures you back in like a drug, that you kind of seek that high again. I love how despite Heather not being involved with the world of fairy and having no threat to her, she still lies to her, kind of, because when Heather goes, I thought you were still in that world, and she's like, fairyland, no, this happened here, I'm staying with Vivi, trying to figure things out, as if she had a choice in this matter, which she kind of does, but she doesn't realize it yet. I also really enjoy how, like, the symmetry going on with Heather talking about how, like, despite everything, she still loves Vivi, and she, like, you know, is trying to describe it, saying, like, you know, there's something about pheromones and symmetry, maybe, like, I have no control over my love for her, that I can't stop it. And it's a symmetry to Jude and Cardan, that despite everything, they have all the reasons to not love each other, they keep going back to one another. When Heather says that, like, I know that Vivi said that she used to live here and that she's a little messed up from seeing her parents get murdered, anyone would be, Jude's like, oh, yeah, I guess I am too, looking at how bloody and cut up she is. But the thing is that one moment would have changed Jude's life a little bit, but that wouldn't have made her into who she is today. It was a piling of things. It was being under the tutelage of Maddox. It was being tormented by fairy children growing up. It was a piling of things that led to who she is today. Also, it's very rude of Taryn to show up in her court dress. She could have changed very easily to mortal clothes to blend in and to also kind of make Jude feel a little bit better. Like, her appearing in her court dress, asking for Jude for help, is kind of a slap in the face. It's like showing, like, hey, this is the life you could have had. I'm not the one exiled. Okay, because this is told in Jude's POV, it's first person, I am feeling the rage alongside her. I want to punch Taryn in the face too. She betrayed her. She used her. She didn't get all the details to know that what she was doing harmed them in the long run. But I have a feeling Taryn is feeling the same way Cardan did, or does right now. When Cardan just played that trick of exiling Jude, thinking that she'd figure out his riddle and come back sooner and be proud of him for figuring out this trick, Taryn probably thinks that, look, Jude is going to be proud of me just as Maddox had, because I helped us, you know, do better in the world. I did something tricky like Jude would have done. She should be proud of me. Not realizing that she never involved Jude. She tricked Jude in the process too. I don't know quite what to say, and like, I keep trying to film a video and stumbling, but like, I still want to raise awareness to this fact that, like, Jude and Taryn have now unalived at least one of the immortal beings, one of the folks. And it's interesting because you don't hear that very often. As far as we know, they could suppress the information, but I feel like it's not often enough that a human unalives one of the folk, and that's why they feel comfortable bringing them into their world and having them as servants and things like that. But here they have two humans who are raised as kind of one of their own, like them, for the most part, and then they turned around and killed their kind. Okay, so like in the first book, I believe I talked more about how Locke is always described as a fox. And I think in a lot of the traditional folktales throughout multiple cultures, foxes are usually sly and they like to test the limits, but often they get burned in the end. And we're seeing that happen here with Locke, that he kept pushing his limits, kept pushing and prodding, and now he's been burned by the least, suspecting person, which is Taryn. In the previous video, I talked about how it felt rude and kind of like a slap in the face for Taryn to show up in fairy dress, like a court dress. It's kind of like rubbing in Jude's face that she's been exiled, but it makes sense in this moment because it'd be even weirder to show up in human clothes to say, I unalived my fairy husband. Like, you kind of have to wear the costume or the outfit to make it feel more real. And Jude points this out too, how even though Jude seems the most like Maddox and following in his footsteps, Taryn hasn't gotten away from it either. She has obviously been influenced and following his footsteps and repeating history by unaliving her husband as he has unalived his wife. Once again, we're seeing Taryn acting more fairy-like than Jude, or like how others would assume, because she grew up in this world, so she adopted their mannerisms, I think, more than any of the others. And we see it because she's not apologizing to Jude for her past actions and helping Maddox and all this. Instead, she's asking something of her. And I feel like, at least to me, it seems like fairies don't really feel guilt. Not really, because they're in a world that's a little bit more self-centered. And to feel guilt, I feel like you have to have a little bit more empathy. They have empathy and they do feel guilt, I think, but not to the extent that humans do. And instead, she's asking Jude something of Jude, like immediately asking her to do something for her, like making a bargain like fairies would, which also makes Cardan apologizing for his past actions at the end of the last book for, treating Jude the way he had more poignant. It's more human-like. Okay, no, I do like Taryn and I do apologize for her a lot of times, but in this moment, I'm going to look at her a little bit more negatively and a little bit more critically. And in a lot of interviews by Holly Black, she talks about how she has done research about con artists because they play a role in a lot of her books. And she talks about how a lot of them kind of like do something for you to then make you feel like you need to do something for them in return. It's this weird like reverse kind of psychology going on. And we're seeing Taryn kind of do that here where like she's helping Jude out, helping her like get undressed, helping her after being injured with like ointment and stuff, because even if she's not doing it consciously, she kind of like knows that now Jude's going to feel a little bit more like she owes her to help her out in the end. It's interesting because as Taryn argues back, she says, I just did what Dad said. I didn't think it mattered. You had all the power and you wouldn't use it, but I never wanted to hurt you. I don't feel like she would have known that unless Maddox had told her that, which means that she never approached Jude, never asked her to be like, hey, I heard about this. Can you do something about it? Instead, Jude comes back from the undersea. Taryn barely sits with her and is already betraying her. Actually, she has had it in the works for so much longer, if I'm to be believed, if I'm right about her with the outfits. So, I think she's just making excuses. And to balance out my hatred towards Taryn right now, I understand a little bit some of her motivations. That, it's hard when you have a sister in general, but to have a twin, and you're both competing for the same thing, but you're taking different paths, and you want your recognition, and you want to succeed, and even though you technically have earned your place in the world, you married into it, which is one of the two avenues you could take as a human. Jude was getting more recognition, she was getting more power, even when she betrayed Maddox, he still liked her more than Taryn. So, I understand, kind of her motivations of what she did. I feel like there has to be more to this than Taryn is saying. That doesn't feel like enough for her to unalive him. I feel like, being left alone, that he didn't love her would hurt, but not to the extent of unaliving, because she also kind of knew what she was kind of walking into. He did play with her, and he did admit that they didn't love the same way that humans did, shit like that. But, she was using him too. He was her ticket to be accepted into this world, unless she was bitter that her acceptance in this world wasn't the way that she pictured it. And going back to my previous video, it seems a little strange to me because she did grow up under Irenia's tutelage, and she did grow up in a household where it was pretty obvious that Maddox and Irenia didn't love each other, but they liked each other, they tolerated each other, they helped one another. It was a marriage of convenience, and that's kind of what hers and Locke's were, but with the veil of pretending it was a love match. But also, I want to move on to how Vivi points out that you can't have Jude go in your place, she's banished. They'll kill her if she is caught. And it shows that Taryn doesn't care. She's like Maddox. She'll let Jude fall on the board if it means that she gets what she wants. Even if she, per se, didn't think about it until this moment when Vivi says it, it doesn't halt her. It doesn't stall her. She still wants to charge forward with convincing Jude to take her place. I forgot that Taryn didn't even know about the geese, because for a moment I was like, oh, Taryn obviously knows that Jude can't lie, even if they glamour her because of the geese. But then Taryn goes, a geese? Why? She didn't know, and she still wanted Jude to take her place and go under this glamour where she couldn't lie, where she would be caught and be killed. Why? By the way, I feel like Taryn definitely is playing both sides, which we see Irenia kind of do too throughout this book, that she's on Maddox's side until halfway through she chooses Jude, but it's more so to protect Oak, whereas Taryn's kind of doing it in her own self-interest. I don't view it too negatively, because she's not the first person in history to do this, but it's still very offensive that she's playing both sides. She's playing Maddox and Jude, and actually is willing to let Jude fall if it means that Maddox is going to be able to offer her more. This dream sequence is so interesting because, on one note, it's Jude's greatest fear, that if she exists in the mortal world for too long, living within its mundane existence, will her time in Elfhame become so unrealistic. Like, it couldn't have possibly been real. It was a dream. It was an Alice in Wonderland dream-like experience. But also, it seems like we're looking at these characters in probably their truest sense, that it's not tainted by Jude's lies or misbeliefs or, you know, just her impression of these characters, that we're actually seeing who they really are. And it's just interesting also to, like, to break it down, like seeing Narcia ignore Locke and Valerian because, one, they're no longer a use to her because they're dead beside her, but also she has her eyes focused on something else, that she willfully ignores things. But then, like, Valerian with his curse, like, that final line does sound like it would have been what he would have said, but also we have to remember that he didn't get to finish his curse, so I don't think it's in action, but her, like, subconscious is trying to find a reason why these things had happened, and she kind of wants to blame something abstract, something out of hand, like fate, like a curse, you know, as to why she's in this position now. And then we look at Locke saying, I knew you liked her to Cardan, that's why I had to have her first. And that definitely feels like something Locke would have said, but it's also her, like, subconscious saying, like, look, he actually did like you from the beginning. Why else would Locke have gone after you if it wasn't because Cardan had eyes for you? And then it ends with my favorite, well, not ends, the dream continues, but my favorite line is, do you remember the party in the maze garden? How I kissed her while you watched? I recall that your hands were on her, but her eyes were on me. Cardan returns. Like, I wish that actually was said out loud. I'm a little sad it was in the dream, but, like, still. Wait, I don't think this actually happened because I'm pretty sure in the first book it's just described that Cardan was making out with two girls at that party. Like, we didn't really know exactly their actions, and I don't think this is true. I think this is her subconscious planting these girls doing actions that are more linked to Jude, because, like, the one is pressing her lips to the edge of his boot, something that Cardan had challenged her to do on multiple occasions in the first book, and another girl kissed his throat. Now, I don't remember if she actually kissed his throat, but she definitely held a dagger to it. And in this dream, though, we're also seeing Cardan in the way that Jude had used to see him, which was a true version. So this is not a lie. This was really him, which is the old version where he, you know, interrupted their lessons and would kick over her ink, which he did do. And he came over to her and goes, come with me. I am a prince of fairy. You have to do what I want, which would have been something he would have said. And that is how he used to act. Oh my god, the symbolism in this. There's definitely gonna be a lot of parts to this chapter. I'm so sorry, but he, as in Cardan, leads me to the dapple shade of an oak tree, then lifts me up so I'm seated on a low branch. He keeps his hands on my waist and moves closer so that he's standing between my thighs. Isn't this better? He says, gazing up at me. Now, the oak tree could be in reference to her brother Oak and that they're standing in the shade waiting for him to take power together, but I think it also means, you know, Elfhame, because we do know that the crown of Elfhame has oak leaves on it. So he lifts her up and puts her on a low branch. He is lifting her up and putting her on the branch of power. It's a low one, it's a seneschal, but, like, he's still lifting her up and putting her there, but he keeps his hands on her waist and moves closer so that he's standing between my thighs. It's as if, like, he is gonna be by her side, but almost like they're about to have sex. So it's a bonding, like, together. Like, he's kind of saying, like, if we are connected, if we're together, we can rule together, we can be in this power together. This dream sequence is brilliant. Like, I'm loving it. If you're reading this for fun, you're probably like, okay, let's move on, let's get back to the action. But as someone that's overanalyzing it, it's so brilliantly done, because now we're seeing her push Cardan away, which is something that she has done time and time again, and she's falling, like Alice in Wonderland, bringing in that reference. And the interesting thing is that the next person she sees is Maddox, the person that had brought her into Wonderland in the first place, into Fairy, but she's, you know, landing on a slab of stone as if sacrifice. That's like what you would connotate as a sacrifice. Think of, like, Narnia. And she feels like a carved doll, and that's exactly how Maddox viewed her. He wanted her to be like his puppet, to maneuver her the way that he wanted her to help, you know, with his schemes and plans, and discard her when wasn't needed in the moment. That's exactly their relationship kind of is. He does love her. It's a little tough. It's not black and white, but that is one angle of their relationship. Dream Maddox is hurt me because he said, if only she'd stopped fighting me, I would have given her everything she ever wanted, which is a lie. But he has said these kind of things time and time again, and we see that kind of. But, like, she only was fighting him because she wanted something and he never would give it to her. He placed the ceiling. All she wanted was to be accepted in this world, and to be accepted, she needed to be a part of it. And he kept preventing her, kept holding her back, kept keeping her within his house, under his power. And it could be in part, you know, a parenting kind of thing. Like, it's hard to see your child's now an adult that needs to make their own adult decisions in their own lives. But also, it's just like a control kind of thing. And if he had just allowed her to become a knight, then she wouldn't have turned to Dane, who was waving that carrot of being accepted in this world. And then it's immediately followed with Verenia saying she was never a obedient girl, not like her sister, pitting each other against one another. It's Jude's subconscious showing that, yeah, you might say that you loved Taryn, but you were always slightly bitter, always slightly competing against her. And if you have a sibling that close in age, like, I know for myself, like, when I was younger, it was a lot of bean counting, a lot of like, that's not fair that they get to do that when I didn't get to do that at this age, or if they're like, you know, get away with certain things and you didn't. And we're seeing, like, you know, Maddox loved Jude, and because of that, that fuels a lot of Taryn's decisions. And, you know, the way that Verenia treats Taryn, you know, caused Jude to react in a different way. It fueled a lot of their actions, but also I think it goes back to this idea of the two of them being kind of seen as almost changelings, because in this world I think we know that they don't really have twins, so changelings is the closest concept that they can understand, you know, having the mortal child and the fairy child. And so you kind of, they're looking at like only one can exist really in this world. You can't have both. When Jude then dreams of Cardan saying, "Of course I'm lying. This is your dream. Let me show you." He presses a warm hand against my cheek. "I love you, Jude. I've loved you for a long time. I will never stop loving you." Now, we do know that he did press a hand to her cheek and said very similar words in the last book, but in her dream, she's trying to justify what happened and why she's feeling this. Obviously, he lied, even though she knows he cannot lie. As a fairy, he cannot. But she wants to believe that he lied to her, because why else would he have exiled her? That, you know, but yet part of her still wants to believe that he does love her, and that's why she's dreaming him saying these words, because she loves him. When Jude wakes up, she goes into the kitchen, sees a pizza box, and, you know, scattered along the pepperonis, someone had placed a bunch of dandelion heads. And there's two things I want to bring up. So one is that is a symbolism of the two worlds kind of merging, because you would imagine dandelions more nature, more the world of fairy, with the pepperoni of like a human world. But also, like, dandelions, the symbolism of it is growth, hope, survival, and rebellion. Think of the Hunger Games, and this is her sign that there's hope for her still. Okay, I'm still a little angry and bitter about Taryn coming residual from the last chapter, but like, I don't know, I have mixed feelings, because she's coming here realizing that like she's pregnant. She didn't want this child to grow up with his head being messed with or being used for stories as she has been used by Locke. So she kind of did what like her mother and what Maddox had done, which is not a great thing, but she could have turned to Maddox, but she doesn't, because then I think she recognizes that he would have then had control over her and her child for his schemes, as he has had control over others, and like wants to have control over Oak, and doesn't want the child growing up in the same environment that her and Jude had, as she says. So she's looking at what Jude has done, that she has convinced Vivi to raise Oak out in the mortal world to give it a more normal life, and that's what she wants for her child. But yet simultaneously, I'm still a little bitter, because Taryn is showing that she has more fairy tendencies than human, that she's come not apologizing, but coming to make bargains and deals with Jude. I love for the last couple chapters, Jude has been trying to say like she doesn't care what happened to Cardan, and that she's bitter and angry at him. You see that she obviously thinks enough about him, and you can tell the sadness in her tone, but also the fact that she has kept her ring, the ring that he had used to marry her, on her finger. It's obviously her hanging on to hope that he really did love her and that things will work out. Jude describes Locke's estate as looking as though it came out of a fairy tale, and I'm assuming that Taryn had cleaned up the inside, which we learn a little bit later, and, you know, making even more of a fairy tale, because I think the two of them love fairy tales. They wanted to spin their own, but Locke, I think, liked some of the scarier elements of fairy tales, whereas Taryn just wanted the happiness of it. So I think the two of them could have been good together. They weren't perfect, but they could have been good. It could have been like a Lydia and Mr. Wickham kind of situation. But also I love that it's described as like tall spires covered in a thick curtain of honeysuckle and ivy. Now honeysuckle represents pure happiness, and ivy is everlasting and, you know, life and immortality and like faithfulness, I think it was. I can't remember exactly, but like it's interesting that these two very happy plants are on the outside of this home, which you would think would be a good thing, but it's covering, almost like squeezing the life out of this home. When Jude says, "While I walk the path of daggers and poisons, she walked the no less fraught path of desire," which I think is two avenues of court politics we see it in Game of Thrones, that you could go around poisoning and stabbing and planning rebellions, but another angle is through alliances. Think of like Marjorie Tyrell's angle. I kind of have mixed feelings because part of me feels bad for Taryn, but part of me judges her choices because when the servant brings in the toast and the marmalade, Jude immediately recognizes the cloying scent as fairy fruit, which Taryn had to recognize too, which means that, yeah, Lockbowie sent it, but how much did Taryn go along with, like, besides this, to be accepted in the world of fairy? But, like, as Jude points out, you can only take so much before you snap. Now, Jude snaps in the first book, but she was taking harder hits, but she was also resisting, which I think led to her being hit harder, whereas Taryn was taking the smaller hits and just absorbing them. It took longer for her to start getting harder hits, but like also Jude learned earlier on that this isn't worth it because I'm not going to get what I want out of it in the end, whereas Taryn, it took so much, she was taking these hits because she thought it'd be worth it because she would get what she wants in the end, only to realize so much later that she's not getting what she wants. The chapter ends with Jude sitting in an open window, which kind of goes back to a couple of moments throughout the other books. We see her sitting in the open window and then falling out of it after she returns from the undersea in the first book. And there's a moment where she sits in her open window in the first book. It's this like kind of pivotal moment of, do I fall back into the world of fairy, or am I going to make a different choice? Stay in the safety or fall into this danger? If you don't already know, I've been doing an in-depth literary analysis of the Girlfriend series. I'm currently working through book 3, Queen of Nothing, and I think this is like my 5th time reading the series, and every other time I would be annoyed with Taryn, but like indifferent. But because I've been doing such a close read, this time during book 3, I have been infuriated by her actions. And then it hit me last night. I remembered something that Jude had said in the second book, the way that she had described Taryn. She said, Taryn doesn't like conflict. Her manner of dealing with all the terror and confusion in her lives has been to become immensely adaptable, like one of those lizards that changes colors to match their surroundings. She's the person who knows what to wear and how to behave because she studies people carefully and mimics them. And all of a sudden, what she does throughout chapters 4 and 5 in this book made a lot more sense. Now, throughout all my videos, numerous times I pointed out that, in my opinion, I think between the two twins, Taryn has adapted more of the fairies' personalities and way of viewing the world. Now, because of their society and how it's set up, fairies are a little bit more selfish because everything's kind of done with bargains and deals. Everything that, like, if you give something to someone, they expect something, they give you something in return. It's a give and take kind of society. And so because of that, you're kind of thinking a little bit selfishly. You're thinking, what can I get if I do this? There's no nobleness or selflessness going on in the society truly at its core. Maybe you might see some outliers, but not really. And we see that with Taryn. The first thing she does when she's reintroduced into this book is make a request of Jude. She doesn't apologize or justify what she did at the end of the last book, at least not until Jude pressures her to do so. And she sees that she's not going to move forward until she gives Jude an answer. And also, though, she's continuing to pressure Jude, even when Vivi points out, if Jude goes and is caught, she will be executed. That doesn't stall her. That doesn't pause her. The thing that pauses her is learning that Jude has a geese. But even then, she continues to move forward. Even if, say, she didn't think of this fact, it doesn't stop her. And that feels very much like Maddox, because in the second book, Jude realizes that Maddox is finally letting her be, a player on the board, but he equally is using her to fall. She is a pawn to fall on the board so then he can achieve what he wants. And Taryn's doing the same thing. In addition, as I was reading this book and she was describing what happened to Locke, something fell off. I literally say in my video for chapter 4, I believe, or 3 or 4, that something fell off, like some detail was missing, and now it hit me. It's because she was spinning a tale. Of course there'd be holes in it. She was mimicking Locke and his way of spinning tales, but he obviously is much better at it than Taryn, and that's why I felt like there was holes in her story. So what I'm trying to say is, because of Taryn's trauma response from her early childhood, she mimics and, copies others, and for the last 6+ months, she's been mimicking and copying Maddox and Locke because they've been the only ones in her life. Now, I'm not surprised that Taryn didn't have any, black dresses. Black seems too severe for her. I'm a little surprised that she didn't have any, richer purples or grays, which would have been shades of mourning done historically. When you were in the mourning cycle, it was a long period of time, usually a year. You would wear black for a period of time, then you would transition into, grays and purples. I'm surprised she doesn't have any of that. But Jude picks bronze. And you would associate that with more so armor, especially the armor that she wears later in this book. Jude is not normally a fashion girly, but I give her props, especially with her hair. This typically would have been a Taryn move. to have fought ahead of this, but her putting her in a chignon, now it's pulling your hair up, which is typically, historically, was the style of showing that you're in adulthood, that you're a woman, married, that you put your hair up. And also, though, it is pulling her hair back, exposing her ears, as if to show, but little old me, little old mortal me, couldn't have murdered my husband. I love that. Once again, we're getting Jude kind of lying to herself, or like omitting things. So she's thinking like she's nervous, sweating, which, yeah, she has some things to be nervous about. She's about to re-enter a court that she's been exiled from, that it could possibly lead to her death. But I think that she's more so nervous of seeing Cardan again. She won't say it, but we can assume that. Jude's like racing thoughts in this moment about Cardan, seeing Cardan again, is so different from every other time, because I don't feel like there's been ever really truly a time where she has been this afraid of seeing him. Not in the first book, definitely not in the second book. Like, even at the end of the second book when she's like, oh crap, he sounds like the High King, even then she wasn't that afraid of him as she is now, seeing him after being exiled. And I feel like in part is afraid of his, who he might have become if he's become more powerful and fearful, but also because of like her emotions. I'm laughing because it's so sad, because she hits a nail on the head but then dismisses it when she thinks, maybe I can pardon myself. But then I remember when I insisted I was the queen of fairy and the guards laughed, Cardan didn't need to deny me. He only had to say nothing. And if I pardoned myself, he would only had to have said nothing again. I don't know who's more excited to see Cardan, me or Jude. I think it's me, definitely me, because I'm over here like, yeah, when he's like, Taryn. Interesting that Cardan is wearing a etched and jeweled breastplate and polished gold hangs from his shoulders, because he normally not wear armor. The only time he did was in the first book during that mock war, and even then it was more decorative than useful, as Jude points out. He wouldn't normally wear this. He wears other kind of style outfits, but I think he's wearing this now because he feels vulnerable, not only with all these enemies all around, but he doesn't have Jude beside him to help protect him. And also it's to guard his heart, in which he says in his letters that never go to Jude that his heart was buried in the undersea when she was there, and it's also in the mortal land with her. The smirk is very telling, because if it was truly Taryn standing before him, he would not have been smirking, because he would have seen someone that had tricked him. He would have seen Jude's face in hers and been upset that she's not there yet. But him smirking is showing that he immediately recognizes Jude. I love this moment where Jude's sitting there thinking, like, I cannot believe I had once had control of the High King of Fairy, and like how arrogant I had been to think that I could keep it. And like, it's hard to realize something till you lost it, I think. But also then she's thinking like the slide of his mouth on mine and how he had tricked me. It's like I had all this power and love and it's now gone, at least in her opinion. Narcia being there, and not only that, but being beside Lady Asha, is so interesting, because it's the three women that have the most influence on Cardan's life, and it's kind of like which one does he pick dictates the direction of his life going forward. But also Narcia saying like, is she really sad, is showing her like bitterness and her jealousy, that even though Locke had moved on from her and she tried to move back to Cardan, she still had feelings for Locke and was bitter that the two of them had ditched her for these two humans. I love this line where Jude's thinking that she knows more of what Taryn wouldn't do and less of what she would do. It's showing that despite the fact that they are twins and they do kind of understand one another, there's still a disconnect. They still don't understand at the heart, their goals and motivations that are, motivating their every actions and what's going on in this other part of their lives. There's a disconnect, and that also counterplays against with Cardan once again, where like Cardan understands and can predict what Jude would do, and he says that in the second book of when she was in the undersea, he imagined her there giving him orders that he nonetheless obeyed. When Jude says, and I've never hurt Locke, Cardan's like, no, leaning forward on his throne, vines shiver behind him, his tail twitches as if in like anticipation and excitement, because he knows this is Jude. And I think Dane has definitely said it, but maybe Cardan has said something similar, where like they're intrigued by the fact that she can lie because they can't. It's so interesting to watch, and he definitely is like, I know you hurt Locke, so I want to see how good of a lie you are, and this is the most excitement I've had in a while, but also you're here. My god, I miss Cardan, even though I literally just finished the second book, but these 66 pages have been the longest because I miss him in his like power of words, because when Jude says I loved him, he responds with, sometimes I believe that you did. Yes, Cardan says absently. Now you could believe that he's playing along talking to Taryn as everyone else does, but like he's talking to Jude because he can't lie. He's saying to Jude, I sometimes did wonder if you did love Locke, which goes into his fear because he's watched Locke take a girl away from him. And like, look at Narcia, she's upset, even though she tried to come back to Cardan. Obviously, she still has feelings for Locke. So he's wondering, does Jude feel the same way? Cardan is having a great time because like he feels like they're in on a scheme together, even though Jude doesn't realize that they're in on a scheme together, but like he knows it's Jude. But like he had tested the whole idea of the geese on her, but very briefly in the last book. But this is where he really gets to see it in action. And like she wasn't affected by a glamour set by the High King, which should be more powerful, but she's also lying. And he's sitting there, his mouth curves, what fine courtly manners. He's like, this is what it would look like if you respected me. Honestly, like, Cardan's so hot when he uses his words so brilliantly, because when he turns to Jude, he says, well, what do you think? Did your sister do it? And when he says, did your sister do it? He didn't say, did Jude do it? He says, did your sister? It's him asking Jude, did Taryn do it? When Narcia interrupts Cardan, contradicting him, we're seeing that even though his grand display of power at the end of the last book hasn't changed that much, he's still being undermined by others, and he still bristles at it, as he should. I'm gonna say this again. One of the reasons why I love Jude is that she lies to herself, that she makes assumptions, the wrong assumptions, and I love that because I hate when YA books where like the main character is smart and knows the right answers and all that. Like, how many of us know the right answers? We're gonna make wrong assumptions and then make wrong decisions based off these wrong assumptions, especially if it is so held together by these misbeliefs and these lies like Jude has. And like right here, we're seeing that she thinks maybe Cardan does want to see Taryn naked. We are identical. But if you read his novella, you'll find out that he has never glanced at Taryn. He's always known which one was Jude out of the pair. The only reason why he messed up in the last book was because, you know, he was suffering from the effects of being poisoned, and like I think because Taryn was wearing the earrings, that might have influenced it a little bit too. But like he has always known, and he knows in this instance that this is Jude and not Taryn. But like he talks in his novella about how like in classes I had always been trained on Jude. He never looked at Taryn, and he said that should be weird because they are mirrors of each other, but to him, Jude has always been the prettier. I love that the moment that they reach Cardan's room, he throws himself down on a low couch. And like, I have a couple theories as to why he does that. One is just because he can relax and shrug off the role of being the High King. But two, I think he's doing it to kind of comfort Jude, to show her like, I'm the High King, but I'm not him. I'm still me, and you know me as the prince that we just lounge on couches. This is the version that you were the most comfortable with. So I think Holly Black doesn't just throw things in just because, like, she could have just said he put his foot up on the table, but she describes the table as being carved to look like a griffin. So I looked up symbolism of griffin, and it's a combination of both the divine and the human, which, like, I think could represent, you know, Cardan and Jude. That's the divine immortal fairy and the human, they're ruled, they're the king and queen, but also it's like a paradox and like shape-shifting and ancient wisdom, which like this, like, you know, the seat of power that they have is ancient, but also the paradox of like, you know, this whole situation and shape-shifting of how easily Cardan sheds one version of himself into another. And the fact that Jude describes Cardan's smile as being a quicksilver conspiratorial grin. He's like, oh, we're doing schemes again. What's our scheme now? And like Jude doesn't realize. She never knows like Cardan thinks that they're doing a scheme together. Also, the stab in the heart feeling I had the first time when I read Cardan saying, didn't you get my letters? What letters? Like, oh, and the letters are chef's kiss. I read them whenever I'm having a bad day. I have them printed out in pretty paper. I'm just giggling because I know that Cardan knows this is Jude. He's like, why is she still playing this game? He's like, well, shall I command you to remove your clothes? I don't mind. The heartbreak I feel when Cardan's like, well, my counselors told me that you were seen with an ambassador of Quarter Teeth, and the way you're acting now, like, tell me we're wrong. And it's showing that he has complete faith in her, even though there's so many evidence to prove otherwise. Like, just this pure, like, trust and faith that he has in her is, like, heartbreaking. Okay, I don't know what to think about this. Like, I just can't process it fully, but it's interesting that within a 2-page period, we have Cardan going, wait, you're afraid of me. And then Maddox showing up going, daughter, don't be afraid. I don't know what to think about it, but I know there's something there. Once again, we're seeing that Maddox is offer protection means very little. And that actually is showing they've never really had a place in this world. Yes, he told Taryn and Jude, making threats that he would, harm anyone that hurt them because it's hurting him in his pride and extension because they're his children, but he's never fallen through. And we've seen other moments where obviously he had to have noticed Jude missing a finger, but he never questioned and never followed through on that threat. So other fairies had felt comfortable enough to be able to, again, call her, you want soup, mortal, calling her mortal, you want to be soup, threatening her. Because there's no repercussions. Why would it? Maddox's words of protection were meaningless. They were empty words, just as his words of offering them a place in this world. He was never really going to offer them a place in this world. This is what I want to see more in books, where, Jude says, Carden was so disarmingly casual, as though sentencing me to death was some shared joke between us. And she's, just saying that, just dismissing it, like, as if it was that. And it's like, no, that actually was what he thought it was. That is the truth. And I love that Holly Black is giving us the truth of the situation, but she is framing it as if it's an impossible situation. The other amazing thing about the story, and one of the reasons why I love it, is that Jude doesn't just change overnight in the first book. She doesn't automatically start trusting Carden. No. She inches towards this trusting Carden, but then finds a situation to go back on her lie and her misbelief. And it continues to happen all the way throughout this book. We're watching her once again push Carden away because she doesn't trust him. She thinks he's playing a trick on her still. And that feels so realistic, because I don't feel like we completely change overnight. We might change for a little bit, but we might find a reason to revert back to her old beliefs and old selves. Finally, Jude is really catching on and calling out, because Arinia says your father's priority was to get you out. And she responds, not just that, right? She knows that Maddox, there was no way he would go in and bring in an army to just get Taryn or Jude out of a situation. He would have just let them fall and hope that they would have gotten themselves out of that situation. Case in point, as he was hoping maybe Jude would get herself out of being exiled. No, the only reason that he did it was the pretense of saving them, but really it was to do something else. There's definitely something else going on in the background. Which that makes me think of Stolen Air, which I will get to that eventually, but that might explain why Jude doesn't go and rescue Maddox and why Oak feels like he needs to. The reason why Jude doesn't is because Maddox would have never done it for her. And why risk so much just for this father figure who wouldn't risk the same amount for her? The only reason why he would have gone and saved her was if there was something else more beneficial to him. She would have been just a pawn in the game. Arinia is saying, I don't question Maddox's plans, nor should you. There's so many layers I can peel back on that, because one, it's very heavily indebted in the patriarchy. She's following the very particular style of court intrigue, where she's following more similar to Alison Hightower, and even Marjorie Tyrell, you're amping up the man's ego in hopes that you benefit from it. But the moment that you question one of their decisions, they get defensive, and then you lose a lot of ground. So you got to manipulate and figure out a different way to get kind of what you want, to change their decision about, confronting them. But her saying also, nor should you. It's not your place as a mortal to question a fairy. It's not our place as women to question a man. So we're seeing Arinia means well, but she's so heavily engraved in this patriarchal and racist system. Once again, we're seeing that Jude loves Maddox, but she fears him. She's describing that here. And the same thing with Carden. She loves Carden, but she fears him a little bit now. And I think it goes back to what I said, I think in the previous book, that Jude was never going to have a healthy relationship. She was always going to be with someone where the feelings are so twisted because of her relationship with her father figure. I love, because we're in Jude's narration, we don't fully realize what Maddox is saying. And because Maddox is describing this in terms of Taryn, that Carden wasn't going to let Taryn go. He literally killed a bunch of knights, bringing walls of the palace down to stop him. But because it's Jude, she doesn't, think that hard about why Carden would do that. And Maddox is phrasing it as Taryn. So we as a reader might not realize the depth of this until a little bit later in the book when it comes up again. Or, if we take a step back and realize, holy crap, wait a minute, Carden didn't know that was Jude. He was trying to prevent Jude from being taken away from him yet again. I really like when Jude says, I can't believe it of Carden, whom I left in his chamber as though he was the one in need of protecting. Even though in the last book, she watched him create an island. She forgot in that instance how magically powerful he was. She thought of him as his old self, the self that he was weak and she needed to protect him, but it's also showing that in that moment, in a heightened moment, she would protect him. Even though Jude has admitted, especially in the last book, that she's not very good at styling herself in a very particular way, Taryn is. She said that in the last book. Carden is, we know. But here, yet again, we're watching her style her hair in a very particular way. So she puts in 2 tight plaids, so braids, and that style is very girlish. So I think she's doing it on purpose to diminish everyone's expectations of her, as just seeing her as Maddox's little girl, so then she doesn't have a target on her. And just like how Maddox feels no alliance towards Jude, Jude feels no alliance towards Maddox. And in part, I think it's because of Maddox's actions in the last 2 books that pushed them farther away. I think she would have done very differently if he had from the beginning allowed her to become a knight. But in this situation, we see her say, but if I had Maddox's plan, I could trade them for the end of my exile. Surely Carden would agree to that. She would trade Maddox over to earn her place back into Fairy. She would rather be by Carden's side than by Maddox. Okay, I have a theory that just hit me right now. I feel like Elfhame is a little sentient. That once you are tied to it as its ruler, it influences you kind of subconsciously. That I think it changed Carden. Yes, I think a lot of other situations helped influence and change him too, but I think the moment that he became the High King, he didn't seem to be wanting nothing to do with power or the throne anymore, as he had leading up to that moment. Now he's still hesitant, but now he wants to protect it a little bit more, to lean a little bit more into its power. And we see the same thing with Jude the moment that she became the Queen of Elfhame. I think prior to this, she would have been fine burning it all down and everyone with it, but now she is the Queen of Elfhame and she would rather not have Maddox, burn it to the ground. She would protect it with her life.